On September 3, 1260, in a valley near the spring of Ain Jalut in Palestine, something happened that wasn't supposed to be possible. For 43 years, the Mongol war machine had rolled across Eurasia without a single permanent defeat. They'd obliterated the Khwarezmian Empire, sacked Baghdad, extinguished the Abbasid Caliphate, the spiritual center of Islam, for 500 years. In January 1260, they took Aleppo in just days, a city that had withstood Crusader sieges for decades. Damascus fell without firing an arrow. The Mongol general Kitbuka commanded approximately 20,000 warriors. Against him stood Sultan Qutuz of Egypt with a roughly equal force of Mamluk cavalry. On paper, this wasn't a contest. The Mongols had defeated larger armies. They'd conquered empires with millions of subjects using forces this size. Yet by nightfall on that September day, Kitbuka was dead, captured alive, defiant to the end, then beheaded on the battlefield. The Mongol army was shattered. Survivors fled 8 miles to Baisan, regrouped, turned to fight once more, and were crushed again. The standard story you'll find in most history books goes something like this. The Mamluks won because they used clever tactics, a feigned retreat that lured the Mongols into an ambush. Sultan Qutuz threw off his helmet and rallied his men with inspirational speeches about defending Islam. Superior numbers, superior morale, superior leadership. But here's what doesn't add up. The Mongols had seen feigned retreats before. They invented the feigned retreat. Genghis Khan's commanders had used this exact tactic to destroy armies from Korea to Hungary. These weren't novices being tricked by playground moves. And the numbers? Recent scholarship suggests the forces were roughly equal, both around 20,000 men. The Mamluks may have had a slight advantage, but the Mongols had routinely won while outnumbered 3-1 or worse. As for morale and religious fervor, the Mongols had faced that before too. Every defender of every city believed their god would save them. It never did. So what really stopped the unstoppable? By the end of this investigation, you'll see this battle, and the Mongol Empire itself, completely differently. Because the truth involves factors no medieval chronicler understood, a weapon historians still debate existed, and a catastrophic natural disaster that happened 7,000 miles away. This is the story of how the greatest land empire in history was defeated not just by human hands, but by forces they couldn't see and couldn't fight. Let's start with what everyone missed at the time. This wasn't supposed to be a fair fight. When the Mongols invaded Syria in 1258–59, they brought approximately 120,000 to 150,000 troops. This was Hulagu Khan's Western Army, the force that had destroyed Baghdad, that had subjugated the assassins, that held all of Persia and Mesopotamia. By September 1260, Kitbuka had fewer than 20,000. What happened to the other 100,000 plus warriors? The official explanation is simple. In late 1259, Mongol Khan, the Great Khan, ruler of the entire Mongol Empire, died during the siege of a Chinese fortress. Hulagu, Monk's brother, had to race back to Mongolia with the bulk of his forces to participate in the succession councils, the Kurultai. This is true. But it's not the whole truth. Here's the detail that's been overlooked. Hulagu couldn't sustain 120,000 troops in Syria even if he wanted to. Mongol cavalry didn't work like medieval European armies. A Mongol warrior didn't ride one horse. He brought 5 to 15 horses on campaign. This wasn't luxury, it was logistics. They rotated mounts to maintain speed over vast distances, used spare horses to carry supplies, and required grazing land measured in square miles per 1,000 riders. Let's do the math. A conservative estimate of 120,000 Mongol warriors with 5 horses each equals 600,000 animals. The Jezreel Valley and surrounding Syrian terrain in 1260 couldn't support this concentration. Not for weeks. Not in summer. John Mason Smith Jr., a historian specializing in Mongol logistics, calculated that Syria lacked the pasturelands necessary for a full Mongol field army to operate for extended periods. The Mongols were fundamentally a steppe-based military system. They needed grass. Lots of it. Syria had rocky terrain, agricultural fields, and settled populations, not the open grazing grounds of Central Asia. But there's something even stranger in the timing. And this is where our investigation takes an unexpected turn. In 1257, 3 years before Ain Jalut, something happened that changed weather patterns across the entire world. Mount Samalas, a volcano on the Indonesian island of Lombok, erupted with the force of approximately 40 cubic kilometers of magma. The explosion was one of the largest in the last 7,000 years. The eruption column reached 43 kilometers into the stratosphere. Ash fell 340 kilometers away. The capital city of the Lombok Kingdom, Pamitan, was obliterated, buried like Pompeii, still undiscovered to this day. What does an Indonesian volcano have to do with a battle in Palestine? The Samalas eruption injected 158 teragrams of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, the single greatest stratospheric gas release of the Common Era. When volcanic sulfur reaches the stratosphere, it forms sulfate aerosols that spread across the globe, reflecting sunlight back into space. Ice core samples from both Greenland and Antarctica show sulfate spikes from 1257 to 1258 that dwarf those from the famous 1815 Tambora eruption, the one that caused the year without a summer, and led to crop failures across Europe and America. Medieval European chronicles describe exactly what you'd expect from a massive volcanic winter. In 1258, England experienced heavy rains and flooding. Crops failed. Matthew Paris, a contemporary English chronicler, wrote of unusual cold, famine, and death. The phenomenon wasn't limited to Europe. Tree ring data from Mongolia shows reduced growth from 1258 to 1262. Chinese records note epidemics and unusual weather. But here's the critical detail that recent climate research has revealed. The Middle East didn't experience the same pattern as Europe and East Asia. In 2021, climate scientists Nicola D. Cosmo, Stefan Wagner, and Ulf Buntken published a groundbreaking study using tree ring data and climate modeling focused specifically on the eastern Mediterranean region around the years of the Mongol invasion. Their findings are stunning. From spring 1258 to autumn 1259, precisely when Hulagu's armies were conquering Syria, the region experienced cooler and wetter than normal conditions. This wasn't a disaster for the Mongols. It was a gift. More rainfall meant more grass for their horses. Cooler temperatures meant they could sustain larger concentrations of cavalry. The climate anomaly from Samalas actually facilitated the Mongol conquest of Syria. But then, in summer 1260, just weeks before the Battle of Ain Jalut, the climate pattern shifted abruptly. The volcanic winter ended. Temperatures snapped back to normal Middle Eastern summer conditions, hot and dry. The carrying capacity of the land for horse-dependent armies plummeted almost overnight. Hulagu didn't just leave because of succession politics. He left because his army was running out of forage. The temporary climate anomaly that had allowed the invasion was ending, and he knew it. This explains something that's puzzled historians for decades. Why Kitbuka stayed with such a small force? He wasn't being brave or foolish. He was commanding the maximum force the land could sustain after the climate reverted. But that was just the beginning. Now we come to the weapons. Contemporary accounts mention that during the close fighting at Ain Jalut, the Mamluks used something called midfa, hand cannons, primarily to frighten Mongol horses and cause confusion. Most historians have dismissed this as either exaggeration or a misidentification of other weapons. Early firearms in 1260? In the Middle East? The standard narrative says gunpowder weapons didn't appear in Muslim armies until the 1300s at the earliest. But the primary sources are consistent and specific. Ahmad Y. Al-Hassan, analyzing multiple 14th-century Arabic military treatises, including works by Al-Ansari al-Dimashqi and Hassan al-Rama, found detailed descriptions of handheld cannons used at Ain Jalut. Al-Rama's text, written around 1280 to 1290, describes the midfa as a tube made initially of reinforced bamboo, later of iron, firing projectiles or bunduks, using gunpowder charges. More significantly, these treatises provide the gunpowder formula used: 10 parts saltpeter, 2 parts charcoal, 1.5 parts sulfur. This is remarkably close to the modern ideal composition for explosive gunpowder: 75% potassium nitrate, 10% sulfur, 15% carbon. A formula that wouldn't be perfected in China or Europe until decades later. The British Orientalist scholar David Nicol, citing the late 13th century chronicler Ibn Abd al-Zahir, notes that iron implements and flame-throwing tubes were issued from Mamluk royal arsenals for military operations in the 1280s to 1290s. The skeptics make a fair point. The term midfa was also used for earlier naphtha projectors, essentially flamethrowers. How do we know these weren't just traditional incendiary weapons? Here's where the evidence gets compelling. The accounts specifically mention the weapons were used to frighten horses, not kill warriors. This matches what primitive gunpowder weapons actually did. Early hand cannons were terrible at penetrating armor or killing people at range. They were loud, smoky, and unreliable. But horses, especially horses that had never encountered explosive noise before, would panic. Mongol military doctrine depended on perfect cavalry coordination. Their feigned retreats, their encirclement tactics, their arrow storms, all required formations of mounted archers moving with precision. Introduce a weapon that causes random horses to bolt, that creates chaos in the ranks through noise and smoke, and you disrupt the entire system. Think about what this meant at Ain Jalut. The Mamluks positioned themselves in the hills. Baybars conducts his feigned retreat, a tactic the Mongols have seen 1,000 times. But this time, when the Mongol cavalry charges after the retreating Mamluks and rides into the ambush, they're hit not just with arrows but with explosions. Not big enough to cause mass casualties, but loud enough, surprising enough, to break formation. To turn an organized Mongol charge into a confused melee. To negate the very tactics that had made them invincible. Now layer on the other factors we've discovered. The Mongol force is already at the absolute limit of what the land can sustain. They're operating with no reserves, no backup force, no logistics train extending back to Central Asia. The bulk of Hulagu's army is gone, withdrawing ahead of worsening forage conditions. Kibuka knows this. He knows he can't afford a protracted campaign. He needs a quick, decisive victory, the kind of battle the Mongols had won dozens of times. And then add one more variable that contemporary sources confirm: the terrain. Ain Jalut is in the Jezreel Valley, but it's not open steppe. It's hilly terrain with scattered vegetation. The Mamluks positioned themselves so the rising sun would be in the Mongols' eyes. They hid the bulk of their forces in the hills among the trees. Mongol cavalry tactics were developed for open grasslands where they could execute massive encirclement maneuvers, where they could see enemy movements from miles away, where they had room to retreat, regroup, and charge again. At Ain Jalut, they had none of that. The Mamluks also had an advantage no one talks about: horseshoes. This sounds trivial until you understand the geology. Syria's terrain is rocky, far rockier than the Central Asian steppe. Mongol ponies traditionally weren't shod. They had tough hooves adapted for grassland, but sustained operations on rocky ground wore them down. The Mamluk horses were shod. This gave them better endurance on the exact terrain where the battle was fought. One more detail about the Mamluks themselves: they weren't Middle Eastern natives. Most were Kipchak Turks from the same Central Asian steppes that produced the Mongols. They'd been captured as boys, brought to Egypt, trained as slave soldiers. They knew Mongol tactics because they came from the same military culture. When contemporary chroniclers later said, "The people of the steppe were destroyed by the people of the steppe," they weren't being poetic. They were stating a fact. The Mamluks could execute Mongol-style tactics because they were essentially Mongols, just fighting for a different master. So now picture the complete scenario. Kitbuka has 20,000 men maximum, the most the depleted Syrian grasslands can support after the climate returned to normal hot, dry conditions. He's facing an enemy of roughly equal size who knows all his tactics, who've chosen terrain that negates his advantages, whose horses are better adapted to the local ground. The battle starts. Baybars conducts his feigned retreat. The Mongols, confident in their experience, charge. They ride into the ambush. The Mamluk forces appear from the hills. And then, crucially, the midfa go off. The explosions aren't devastating in themselves, but they create chaos in the Mongol ranks at exactly the wrong moment. Horses panic. Formation breaks. The Mongols push forward anyway because they're professionals, because they've overcome worse, because turning back now means defeat. Contemporary sources describe the fighting as lasting hours, not minutes. The Mongols nearly broke through the Mamluk left wing. At one point, Kutuz himself had to lead his reserves into the fight, throwing off his helmet, the famous dramatic moment chroniclers loved, and shouting religious slogans. But the mathematics of attrition were working against Kitbuka. He had no reinforcements coming. His soldiers were operating at the very edge of their logistical capacity. Every casualty was irreplaceable. Every dead horse, every exhausted mount, narrowed his options. When Syrian auxiliary troops, who'd been fighting for the Mongols, defected to the Mamluks mid-battle, the calculus shifted completely. Kitbuka tried to rally. Contemporary Persian sources record his defiant words when urged to flee: "Death is inevitable. It is better to die with a good name than to flee in disgrace." He fought, according to the chroniclers, like 1,000 men. But in the end, his horse faltered. He was captured alive and brought before Kutuz. The execution followed immediately. Kutuz mocked Kitbuka, calling him a despicable man who'd shed blood wrongfully, who'd broken promises, who'd overthrown dynasties. Kitbuka's final words, preserved in the Jami al-Tawarik by the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, were a warning. Do not pride yourself on this victory. When news of my death reaches Hulagu Khan, the ocean of his wrath will boil over, and from Azerbaijan to the gates of Egypt will quake with the hooves of Mongol horses. Hulagu Khan has 300,000 renowned horsemen like me. You may take one of them away. It was an accurate assessment of Mongol strength. But it was also wrong about what would happen next. Here's what Kitbuka couldn't have known. The same climate disruption that had crippled his army was destroying the Mongol Empire from within. The 1259 epidemic that killed Monk Khan during the siege in China? Recent research suggests it may have been cholera, triggered or worsened by the climate chaos from the Himalayas eruption. The drought and famine that peaked in Mongolia and eastern China in 1259 to 1260? Triering data links it directly to volcanic climate forcing. These weren't just unfortunate circumstances. They were the beginning of the empire's fragmentation. Monk's brothers Kublai and Erik Bok fought a 4-year civil war for the throne. Hulagu never got his revenge on the Mamluks because he spent the rest of his life fighting his own cousin, Berk Khan of the Golden Horde, who'd converted to Islam and was furious about the destruction of Baghdad. The unified Mongol Empire ended. Within 2 decades it would split into at least 6 independent khanates, often at war with each other. Ain Jalut was the visible symptom of something larger, the environmental and logistical limits of steppe-based military power when operating far from its homeland under deteriorating climate conditions. But here's the strangest part of this story. For centuries, Arab chroniclers mythologized Ain Jalut as a divinely ordained victory, proof that Islam would survive, that faith could overcome barbarism. Modern historians created their own myth, the triumph of Mamluk military genius over Mongol arrogance. Both narratives ignore the uncomfortable truth: battles aren't decided by single factors. They're decided by cascades of circumstances, many of them invisible to the people fighting. The Mamluks won because a volcanic eruption 7,000 miles away temporarily greened Syria's grasslands, allowing the Mongol conquest, then removed that advantage by ending just before the decisive battle. Mongol logistics, dependent on vast horse herds and grassland, couldn't sustain field armies in the settled, rocky terrain of Syria for extended campaigns. The Mamluks possessed, and likely used, early gunpowder weapons that, while not deadly, disrupted Mongol cavalry tactics at critical moments. The terrain at Ain Jalut negated Mongol advantages in open field maneuver. Mamluk commanders were themselves products of steppe culture and understood Mongol tactics intimately. The Mongol force was already at maximum logistical capacity, with no reserves and no reinforcements possible. Climate-driven disasters across the Mongol Empire prevented any sustained attempt to avenge the defeat. Remove any 3 of these factors, and the Mongols probably win. Keep all 7, and Mamluk victory becomes not miraculous, just probable. This raises uncomfortable questions about other turning points in history. How many battles were decided by weather patterns nobody recorded? By logistics nobody thought to explain because they seemed obvious to people at the time? By technologies that existed but weren't recognized as significant until decades later? The hand cannons at Ain Jalut are particularly haunting. If the midfa really were used, and the evidence strongly suggests they were, then gunpowder weapons appeared in Middle Eastern warfare a century earlier than the standard history claims. But because they didn't immediately dominate the battlefield, because they were used for psychological effect rather than direct killing, they were forgotten, dismissed, or misidentified. It took modern scholars analyzing medieval Arabic technical manuals, texts that survived in obscure collections, to reconstruct what actually happened. How much of history are we getting wrong because we're looking for the wrong things? The standard narrative of Ain Jalut, brave Mamluks defeat invincible Mongols through superior tactics and morale, is emotionally satisfying. It's the story we want to be true. But the real story is more revealing. The Mongols lost because they were operating a logistical system dependent on environmental conditions that had temporarily changed, then changed back at the worst possible moment. Because they were using 13th century technology against an enemy that had secretly advanced to 14th century weapons. Because they were fighting far from home, at the end of long supply lines, while their empire collapsed behind them. Victory didn't belong to the bravest or the most righteous. It belonged to whoever held the most advantages when the mathematics of battle came due. In October 1260, Sultan Quz was riding back to Cairo in triumph when he was assassinated by his own general, Baybars, the man who'd commanded the vanguard at Ain Jalut. Baybars took the throne and spent the next 17 years securing Mamluk power. Hulagu Khan raged, assembled armies, and died in 1265 without ever avenging Kitbuka. The Mongols tried invading Syria again in 1281, 1299, 1300, 1303, and 1312. Each time, the Mamluks held. Because each time, the fundamental problem remained. You can't sustain steppe cavalry in the settled Middle East without the grasslands to feed them. The lesson of Ain Jalut isn't that the impossible can happen. It's that the impossible is usually revealing our incomplete understanding of what's possible. Somewhere under the modern city of Lombok, Indonesia, lie the ruins of Pamitan, the kingdom destroyed when Samalas erupted in 1257. And 7,000 miles away, in the Jezreel Valley of northern Israel, tourists visit the site of Ain Jalut, reading plaques about the battle that saved the Islamic world. Nobody connects the two. But 3 years of volcanic winter, and the abrupt return to normal climate, shaped that battlefield as surely as swords and arrows. The hidden weapon that broke the Mongols wasn't in anyone's hands. It was in the air they breathed, the grass their horses ate, and the calculations they couldn't make because they didn't know the world had changed.